So I'm going to go a little bit more into your bios just for a minute. Winnie has a background in architecture, specifically here in Hong Kong with the government, the city of Hong Kong. And she's currently the deputy head of a very interesting project called Energizing Kowloon East, which is just across the water, which is a new policy initiative that is sort of revitalizing an industrial area that, like many industrial areas, needs revisiting from a planning and development perspective. The idea there, and of course elsewhere with these similar projects, is to evolve in such a way as to be sustainable in terms of economic, community, and cultural development. And so far, this has given Kowloon East, this has resulted in a 1 kilometer long linear waterfront park, designed environments for public programming, as well as a public art program, among other things. I'm skipping. I'm going to skip around because apologies for reading from my phone. My iPad rebelled. Cassius Taylor Smith is the founder of Giant, as Stephanie mentioned, which is a consultancy in urban strategy for development, design, and arts industries based here in Hong Kong. And as a strategist, he works in urban improvement, design, public arts, and communications, kind of spanning corporate and civic and public agendas. As everyone here on the panel kind of is, I think. So that's something we'll certainly touch upon. He's also the co-founder and former director of Very Hong Kong, a multi-location arts festival here, and the facilitator or curator and producer of Event Horizon, which is a citywide public art project featuring the work of Anthony Gormley, who is a Turner Prize-winning British artist. Ryan joined us from the US, where he's an urban planner, designer, and just has a new book out just last week called Where We Want to Live, which is about exactly what it sounds like it's about. And his graduate work at the Georgia Institute of Technology resulted in the Atlanta Beltline, which is a sustainable redevelopment project that has already begun to occupy a 22-mile stretch of a 22-mile rail corridor that connects how many neighborhoods? 45 neighborhoods in Atlanta of socioeconomic diversity. So far, the stretches that have been developed, it's going to take a few years to finish it, but they've broken records in terms of attendance. And Ricky joins us from the Office for Metropolitan Architecture here, where he's worked kind of most recently, I think, on the Taiwan Industrial Heritage Transformation Project, which is in the capital city of the Shanxi province. I'm sorry, I'm butchering everybody's languages here. Which is one of China's industrial centers and has been since the imperial era, since there were industrial centers. And again, it's a very ambitious project that is about heritage revitalization, but is also kind of plugging Taiwan into a larger contemporary cultural context in China. So it's not just about preservation or responsible repurposing, but it's about kind of changing an area from one of industrial production to one of cultural production. And again, I think this is something that all the projects mentioned share, is this kind of this transition, but it's still production oriented. And that project is in a very massive 200-hectare campus or former fertilizer plant complex. So speaking of fertilizer, I suppose kind of brings us to the central question here, which is how does art, or perhaps the arts in general, kind of nourish urban life, I suppose you would say, from a social perspective, from an economic perspective, and what are the mechanisms of that effect, and how does culture kind of mitigate and broker relationships between communities, between designers and artists as well, of course, but also public and private powers that are basically kind of major influences, if not totally controlling people's lives. So So, and I think I'll turn it over to you guys now. But one of the main questions that I think a lot of people, everyone will have addressed from several perspectives, is the question of accessibility, both from a logistical standpoint, right, like getting people there and out of there and around the area and so on, but also accessibility in kind of a more programmatic sense. So, in this idea that everyone's trying to get a bunch of people into a spot where those people aren't used to going yet. And so, and how, what has come up for you in terms of this accessibility question, and how are you kind of mitigating it through design choices or through curatorial choices, as the case may be? Just go. Winnie.
Okay. Thank you for the introduction. I work in a government office. This is called the Energizing Kowloon East office. Thanks for some of the slides. Just let it flow out, and as I talk. I joined this office 4 years ago. I'm an architect in background. When I come to this area, it is Kwun Tong, Kowloon Bay. And these two areas are all industrial area. They are developed in the 1960s. And when I come here, I see a lot of lorries, a lot of industrial activities, a lot of goods. And my duty is to transform this area into a better place to live, to work, and to play, and a commercial district, a better commercial district. So my office is actually under a flyover. As the slides rose, yes, this one. I'm actually under this flyover. And next to my office, I see a space. And so we start to think, actually, this space is quite beautiful in the eyes of the architect. So I think maybe just with some simple work, some painting and color, maybe we can change this space to something else. And talking about accessibility and programming, my office we are architects, planners, and engineers. We are not from the art sector. We don't know how to do programming. We just see the space. But you know how important is the space in relation to art. As you see from the Art Basel, every painting needs a wall, and every sculpture needs a space, right? So just to tidy up the space and let the people tell us how they would like to use it. And this is some of the response we get from the community. They just come with a lot of interesting ideas. Initially, we do sponsor 1 or 2 events, the dance and music. And then the people use it, they like it, and they spread out the words. And so the accessibility actually grows out very organically. And since this flyover space was opened, we have 120 events. And just the first 2 events are those sponsored by us. The rest just send us an email, give us a phone call, and ask whether they can use it for music, dance, and a lot of other things, and sport events. So what we can offer is actually urban space, and the idea are from the community. And there are also other examples like this waterfront. It is a cargo handling area, and when the cargo handling area is removed and turned into a park, people are actually very creative. If you allow the kind of a freedom in your management and facilitate good things to happen, it will happen. So one of our duty is also to facilitate, like community art events. If anyone is interested to organize community festivals and art events in that area, which is non-profit making, which can bring a lot of benefit to the community, they are welcome to contact our office anytime. And we have a group of what we call facilitation manager and promotion manager to help them to go through all the government procedure and process, and Cassius know. It's not easy to organize your sculptures. A very interesting project in Central, right?
Indeed. Yeah, thank you. I think, and the two major experiences which I've had in Hong Kong, one of which was very Hong Kong, as you mentioned, which was a community-level public arts festival, multi-sited. Our key site for our first weekend was Kwun Tong, working very closely with you. It was great to work with the office. And there were challenges inherent in that, one of which was getting access to use public space. It was Kwun Tong was one site, Wan Chai in the Star Street district was a second one, which we had. Eventually, we got the permission to use it as a sort of pedestrianized street because it doesn't have through traffic for street fashion catwalk, micro galleries, street performances, all sorts of things that happen there. And then the third site was where Art Central now is this week, which is the Central Harbourfront venue. Before it was, I think, encircled with a fence and privately managed for sort of public events. And so part of it was getting access to public space, what constituted available, usable public space, and how we could be permitted to use it. And in a similar sort of fashion, we were a platform to enable arts organizations, artists, and other institutions to put their content onto the platform that we were basically getting a blanket permission for. Otherwise, they would never really had the opportunity to present their works in the public realm. So that was the sort of the bureaucratic background that was very difficult. I think the other challenge that we had was one of response from the public who, in our planning of Very Hong Kong, said, well, people aren't going to want to do events outside in Hong Kong. It's unlike, I think we're coming from London as I did and been involved in the London Festival of Architecture there. It was a very, it's commonplace to have these outdoor cultural experiences using the city infrastructure. So conceptualizing this festival to use the space here was very difficult and didn't have a precedent, really. And then it's extremely different for the Anthony Gormley Event Horizon project, which has got another 2 months to run before it's deinstalled. But that was, again, it's using very unconventional parts of the city as a public space backdrop. It's using the city as the place to exhibit, whether it's under private ownership or it's under government control. And there was no real permitting process to allow public art. There's lots of forms for the installation of signage, advertising signage, mobile masts, and those sorts of things. And we didn't want to use that because we didn't want it to be misconstrued as advertising and so on. But we basically had to create precedent with the support of Carrie Lam and I think 14 different government departments to make that work. So, what is the infrastructure that we can use in Hong Kong was a really hard place to start.
And unlike Energizing Kowloon, this project, just as an example, had many different funders, right?
Yeah, Very Hong Kong itself had, if I remember rightly, I think about 8 principal sponsors who are mainly corporate, and the Anthony Gormley project, Event Horizon is sponsored with our lead partnership with K11 Art Foundation, and then a range of other supporters. We've got 23 sponsors and partners in total. It takes a massive team effort to make this sort of thing happen. We didn't tap into any government funding for it. In fact, what we wanted was the support from government to enable it, to allow it to happen, rather than it being a top-down government-funded initiative. It was one that we wanted very much to come from the city for public benefit, but not from government as such.
Come to Kowloon, Cassius. Actually, just to supplement, we don't just facilitate art events. We facilitate many fun events, sports events. The marathon run, on the 10th of April, another run, our city marathon run will be coming. 10,000 people will be running, and that would involve a closure of road. And I fully understand. I also work with more than 10 departments. They are worrying about this and that, and we are quite used to this kind of facilitation. And closing a road for a run and closing a road for a one-day art event is the same. So once some party have done it the first time, the others can follow the footstep much easier.
I think that complexity of both sort of the organizational complexity of getting things done and accomplished is reflective of the most interesting cities in the world are very complex, and it just sort of goes with the territory that it's hard to get done, not only in this sort of process, but also in the richness of the things that people do, not just art, but also running and all kinds of other things. I've been researching projects like Winnie's around the world, and this is sort of this emerging sort of, there's something in the water globally where people are reinventing old infrastructure, the highway and the waterfront in this case, for something new. And it's all the stories are very similar in the sense that somebody's sitting in their office window and looking at a space and thinking, wow, that could be used for something else, and adding new layers of civic life and economic opportunity and all these things to these layers of infrastructure makes, we need to, especially in cities that are changing, like Hong Kong and like Atlanta in a very different way, changing culturally, changing in population and growing a lot, and having to rethink who they are and what you do with these spaces, and creating an infrastructure of opportunity for other things to happen. It's sort of not in a way, it's not the infrastructure that's the change, it's the way that people live their lives. But you have to have that infrastructure in place. And with the Atlanta Beltline, which is a 22-mile loop of railroads circling Atlanta, it's multiple infrastructure in the future. It's transit, it's a multi-use trail and greenway, 1,400 acres of new parks, affordable housing, economic development, public art, health, brownfield remediation. These are old industrial territories with thousands of acres of redevelopment sites along the way, 45 neighborhoods, very complex, sort of in every possible way, including the agencies and organizations required to do it. But the public has embraced it, and they fell in love with the vision for their future, and that is what's sort of carrying it through. But part of that is that people come to it for different reasons. Some people like it for the transit or the economic impact or whatever. They come to it for a different reason, but they see themselves as part of a much larger sort of cultural transformation. And it's really that cultural transformation that is the most important, because that's what makes it work in the end and makes it worthwhile.
You just said something quite interesting about the perception of the people attending that they're participating in a cultural transformation. That's quite interesting, is like it's showing up. Because the mechanism we're describing, despite the crazy complexities of the bureaucratic stuff and the curatorial and political whatever, the gesture is the same, right? You're putting a thing somewhere. So that, and then people go look at the thing, and then they're in the spot you wanted them to go to. And then, as you described earlier, then they just do it.
The best example in Atlanta is the Lantern Parade, which is this. I mean, we've got 2 miles of a 22-mile loop built. We're just in the very early stages of implementation. But this group of people, this crazy lady who I love, named Chantel Ritter, had this idea that a parade is something that you participate in, not something that you just watch. And that she had this idea of making homemade lanterns and walking down the trail at night. And the first year there were a couple hundred people showed up to do this. And the second year there were about 400 people. And the third year, 60,000 people, walking down this, what is essentially a slab of concrete that's a couple miles long, but family-oriented, smiling kids, free. It's sort of illustrated this pent-up demand for a sort of cultural life in the city that didn't exist. I mean, there was no place for it before. There was no infrastructure for that to happen before.
Just make a space, as you said, basically.
Yeah, same for us, because we encounter a lot of projects that having these kind of environments that the client want us to kind of plan a cultural venue in a no man's land. So normally how we usually do in our office, we have a very deep research about the context and also to understand what's the kind of local culture it's about. And then we're trying to, for example, instead of always start with for example, a museum or a gallery, we're trying to, for example, also injecting a kind of production elements within the master plan. For example, we would propose, for example, a school, next to the prison, so that every day there are some population going there. and then maybe then the next phase would be introducing another kind of gallery space or exhibition space, so that when the students finish their work, then they could exhibit in that area. So it's very similar to what other kind of Chinese cultural prison, for example, 798, that is a prison for the artists to work and also for them to live and also for them to exhibit, and then they could also sell their products at the same area. So our office is actually always thinking about like it's more or less a production and consumption cycle. So that it's not about a dead end that, okay, it's only happened a few days, a year or a month. That's only people go with a big influx of people going to that destination.
I guess sort of cultural integrity in particular, ex-industrial areas is quite an important thing. Whether something is generated from that space, because often those industrial places become the cheap, big space that artists and creative industries can use. And then by being popular and being cultural as spaces, then of course they become more interesting for commercial development. Right. And are those artists then able to stay there? I think it's great that Energizing Kowloon East office is there to do both sides of the development, to try and preserve that nature, whilst also doing the commercial development. But it's all too often, whether it's Shoreditch, for instance, in London, it's completely.
Thank you. But these, for instance, in the case of, it's interesting because the models we're discussing now really do seem to vary from like the Williamsburgs or the Shoreditches of the world, which were, or even Soho, decades ago, which were, the artists went and then the money went. Whereas we're putting artists in front first, right? And there wasn't the moment where the industrial spaces were kind of moved into. And so it's hard to know whether they would have been otherwise, right? I mean, my impression is that, for instance, in this massive fertilizer facility, that it probably wasn't going to become like a blossoming, artist community organically, right? And I suppose, it's just very interesting and very transparent almost, right? Because you're trying to sustain economic development in an area, so you put artists there. It's kind of counterintuitive, artists being pretty like left-leaning generally, right? So are you concerned with these models? I'm not saying the word that begins with a G and ends with an entrification, but is there conscientious planning for the sustainability of a income diverse community, I suppose?
It is a very complex social issue of transformation of an old area. There are so many stakeholders we have to take care of. And to me, I see the potential for everyone. If we increase the supply on, say, on giving opportunities for more Class A office, then those are in the Class B office can move up, Class C move to Class B, and then eventually along the chain, there are more space for everyone to use. So to provide more space and more opportunity to the society as a whole, and everybody should come in and explore the potential in that area instead of just allowing it to be as it is. And we talk about the change. Sometimes the change just come by doing small things. It's not necessarily big infrastructural and big changes like buying out a large piece of land and redeveloping. We are not talking about that kind of change. The change that sometimes we do is just to remove a fence from, I'm not sure if you realize in one of the slides, some of the things we did is just to remove a fence wall, the metal fence, and allow the park and the people come closer together, removing the boundary and the access. And we like this bottom-up approach, doing small things and watch out in the city. And the accessibility can be much improved by just adding some zebra crossing to a road junction, as simple as that. So these things won't disrupt the original texture of the place, but helping it to grow more organically and from a bottom-up approach to find its way to a better future. That's what we're trying to achieve.
Yeah, I guess, I mean, related to that, I mean, the point you're making about whether artists and creativity and culture is purposely injected into a space by way of a sort of placemaking, branding exercise can be very cynical. And I think it is something to be very wary of. Whereas if it's a bottom-up approach where it has greater integrity, it's people that just need space. They need a platform in which to present their work or in which to integrate and to have people interact with their work. So that's, if it comes with integrity, that's great. But it can be very, very dangerous, I think, to lead with art by way of a sort of placemaking marketing exercise if it's not sort of innately, resident in some way.
And we always treasure the diversity in Hong Kong and the diversity in Kwun Tong. So allowing big corporates, but at the same time allowing very, very small workshops inside industrial buildings to be there is actually the most beautiful ecology that we should keep in the city. So the balance is very important.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting models to look at for example for the East Kowloon, because for example these parks, Hong Kong is really lack of these kind of open space that people could gather during the weekdays or the weekends, because in many parks in Hong Kong, I think we just discussed in the backstage that in these open space a lot of things are not allowed to do. And then because sometimes these spaces were organized or they managed by developer. Yeah, and also to echoes about because currently there's a trend that developer is trying to introduce art into their development. For example, we have shopping malls that they exhibit art.
It's planned in tune, right?
Yeah,
Instead of it being, you can date buildings now. Interestingly, like you can pinpoint the era not just on the architecture but on how the art is integrated.
Yeah. I think that is something, it's very interesting models to look at. But however, also we saw the other side of this model, there are some government-driven projects that they use commercial elements in order to promote art. Because for developer, they're using art to promote their development. Mm-hmm. So sometimes there's a kind of interesting relationship that's how to kind of bring in economy and kind of sustainable models into these new developments and infrastructure.
I think the other thing to mention about that is a lot of these corridors, at least the ones that I'm researching, not just in Atlanta but all over, they're old industrial territories, and they're obsolete, and the industry is either gone or leaving, and so there's a lot of space. So you're not necessarily replacing people; you're just opening up for new sort of population. And the question is how that transition happens and where the ideas come from. And when they come from communities, especially the communities there, then they're going to inherently have embedded in their vision an idea around them being able to stay, the communities being able to stay. And so in Atlanta, for example, the people who supported this project from the beginning came from every across the economic spectrum, and so because they're part of the vision, then we have to be accountable to them. So if we want to call the project a success, then we have to be able to say, then it has to be for everybody, and that's challenging. But at least we're having that dialogue in a way that we're not having it about any other infrastructure project in town. Mm.
Yeah, that's interesting, actually. A couple of things came up. It seems like, again, it's back to accessibility or even mobility, whether that's social mobility or cultural mobility, whatever that means, or economic mobility. And again, very literally, like you can now get to a thing because the fence is gone.
Well, just building on that too, I meant to say that, sometimes it is little thing you can do. Sometimes it's big, and I mean, the Beltline is a railroad. It was literally the barrier between different neighborhoods of different socioeconomic backgrounds, historic, cultural, racial, everything. And now we're taking that barrier and we're making it into a meeting ground. So it's the seam between places, and it has a real beauty in that way. But these projects like the LA River, similar thing, big linear corridor, barrier between places, industrialized, lots of lower income communities, a lot of similar kinds of things. And when you start activating that place and making it desirable. Part of that is making sure that the communities along the way are part of that and have access to not only the physical benefits of those spaces, but also the economic opportunities that are presented by that new investment.
A couple new themes. A number of you have mentioned with programming that, say, for children, or for instance, the park at Kowloon East has some very fun play structures on them, and then there's this idea of a school. Which again seems very antithetical to the origination of the original purpose of these environments, which were for work, and they almost like for the kind of work that's oppressive and dark. Could you say something a little bit about this? I don't know if it's a sort of emerging discussion about play.
Well, in our case, it is actually like city experiments. We provide the space and we watch how people use the space. And the interesting thing is that my office is actually next to this flyover site. And my colleagues always like to watch and how people behave in this area. So many interesting things. People come for wedding photo. We see a guy proposing a marriage to to his girlfriend, and people bring their musical instrument to come. And one night, Friday night, I hear a lot of drumming, and maybe a music studio nearby. They actually bring their drumming class to the flyover space. So gradually, the space finds its own character. The character is music and dance. The reason why music and dance are the first comers to the space is that there's no residential building nearby. So noise is not a problem. I never have complained about noise, and they play loud music there. And so I think Hong Kong is lack of this kind of very vibrant space and protected by weather. And then gradually another kind of activity come is the sports. The running people come because of this park, and people start the jogging in the morning and at the evening time, and running has becoming very popular. So I really like this bottom-up organic. I use these two words several times. This is the way how the space should be. It is actually growing out from the community, and we don't want to impose too many programs or too many design into it. Just allow it to be free and simple.
I think it's because when this is something that is not expected from your office or from the government, isn't it?
Well, we know that people will use it, but how they're going to use it is really interesting. And it's very glad that we see this space just grow, and is almost like has its own life and grow out its own character. And some of the park space as well, and we are watching.
Yeah, I think it's sometimes for these kind of developments, you don't have to do much. You just have to really provide an infrastructure for them, and then you have a few anchor programs, then they would naturally, organically fly.
Almost like that. And one thing that is important is the management style. One time our security guards are just too good. They watch too closely to the activities. And every time our colleague has to almost like a training to them, to tell them to step back. Don't worry about the kicking on the wall and the bumping of the bicycle on the container wall. If there is a scratch or if there is a bumping on the metal panel, it's the style and character. But every time we change the guard, we have to do that training again. They are really sometimes too good and too caring.
Yeah, I think going to the issue of play and then care, it's been really interesting to watch people interact with the sculptures of Anthony Gormley's in the public space, because we put them in and they're on no plinth, they're behind no cordon, they've got to take their place very much as pieces of the public realm. You can't treat them reverentially. They've got to be robust. And so that people can kind of do what they want with them, really. So we've had people dressing them up in biker denims. We've had people putting a busker's guitar and speaker and a money collection box in front of his feet. And we did even, sadly, I say sadly, I mean, but it's partly people's response. Someone actually graffitied on it last week. Thankfully, it's robust enough that we could get it off pretty easily. But the other interesting thing about accessibility was that the week after it was installed, we knew that people were going to come across this sculpture and it was going to be pretty extraordinary to them, and nothing is installed on public pavements in Hong Kong. And so this kind of set this precedent that it can happen, hopefully a bit more. But someone did walk headlong into the sculpture, probably whilst looking at their phone, and which was interesting because the purpose of the project is to get people to look up around their city. And the response of that particular person was to phone the police. And they complained about the sculpture as a public nuisance, and that people should be protected against it. And so a fence was erected around it within about 20 minutes. So it's interesting about what the public perception has been from certain parts about what is appropriate in public space, whereas a lot of people have really embraced it and had fun with it.
Cassius, you touch on a very interesting subject about how good we should protect these public art, right? You see some of my slides. We have art at the back alley, a kind of graffiti, but actually some of the artwork are very, very nicely done. The big baby are very nicely done. We work with an organization. They are the Run Our City. They organize marathon run, but they also like to organize running at the back alley. And we talk to them, if you run along the back alley, can we have some color and interesting thing on the wall? And so we started this project. We identified owners who's willing to donate a wall, and they lined up artists to draw on it. But we talk about this maintenance and protection of artwork, and we have to be understand that this is not high art. We are not talking about fine art in the Louvre Museum or what. It's a back alley art. So back alley art has to somehow a dialogue. You can take it as a dialogue with the public. If they want to graffiti on it, if they want to do something to it, take it as a dialogue between the people and the artwork. It will fade out. It will be run down one day, and that's the story of the art piece, right? So we all take this kind of concept when we work out this back alley art project. But very interestingly, the nice piece, the big baby, are very well respected, right? And I do see some graffiti on one of the artwork, but it's on one side. It's not directly on the face of the baby. Fingers crossed. I hope it's still it will last like that. But yeah, you bring out a very good point about these public art and the graffiti or whatever done to.
In terms of the high-low thing, which kind of circles back to the accessibility question, do you, as designers, architects, curators, feel that when you're designing for the public realm, or when you're selecting work and selecting a methodology or a design approach, do you feel that you're compromising your high design standards or your curatorial standard because you're figuring out how to make things kind of accessible on this programmatic level?
I think as architects or a master planner, I think usually our design it's very adaptable. We want to control something, for example, for the programming, but then we also when we design and when we propose a program, we also have to realize that the program has a kind of adaptive nature of itself. So it's not about we want to put a program in this area and it would happen as what we planned it. Because when we design something, we always kind of foresee that there will be some changes when it was being planted. So for us, our design usually have this kind of organic growing nature. And then by also injecting kind of phasing strategies, sometimes we allow these kind of organic changes do it in their own way.
For us, we do have a theme for our back alley art. Well, while we're talking about a bottom-up approach allowing freedom, every time we tell the story of this industrial heritage to the artists, because Kwun Tong started in 1960s as an industrial area, we have actually a very good consultancy team who dig out all the history about these manufacturing companies and textile, garment, plastic flowers, which are all famous products in Hong Kong in the past, and bring back a lot of memories to people in Hong Kong, toys, products. So we share with them the story, and it depends on how much they would like to take on the stories, but somehow they would relate back to the main theme, but allow a lot of flexibility and freedom.
But it's another question that comes up a lot is whether the person generating whatever the cultural input in is local or not. And it's, and the philosophies are, it's a bit of an awkward navigation, but you don't want to be like a cultural diplomat and be like one artist from here, one artist from there.
In Atlanta, we've taken a fairly neutral position on that, maybe out of necessity, but providing sort of the infrastructure for permanent, temporary, performative art throughout the corridor, planning and designing for that. But to your question, the people making the decisions about those things ultimately, so from a design standpoint, it's fairly neutral. The implementation of that design a little bit, we'll see how that shakes out. But the decision making is critical because it matters. And right now we're trying to elevate the conversation in Atlanta, which needs its conversation around arts and culture to be elevated. So we're trying to do that, but that's partly what the project is doing. It's not only catalyzing the physical change of the city, it's catalyzing a larger dialogue and discussion about what life in a city is about, including public art.
Speaking of adaptability, what Ricky brought up, since this will be my last question, and then we'll squeeze in a couple audiences, I wanted to inquire how you were relating to technology in these projects. Maybe you already answered it, because of course communities and culture and aesthetics change very quickly, right? So you can't do something that looks super, it's like, you don't want the 90s kitchen forever. And in the same way, you have to kind of adapt for these kind of major technological changes, and I'm wondering what the considerations have been, particularly in the larger infrastructural stuff, the parks. And
at the moment, very low tech. Very basic. We want it to be very approachable, and whoever, you just come out of your own dance studio, then very simple tools, and you can enjoy the space. But, what we are heading towards is Kowloon. We work on the transformation of an area, and we also have a vision to use Kowloon as a pilot smart city. So I see a lot of interest in the IT sector in this area as well. So there are a lot of opportunity using mobile phones, send your image and integrate it in a certain artwork or some lighting effect under the flyover, things like that. I'm really looking forward. If you have any proposal like that, do come to Kowloon.
For us in our projects, we have a kind of sustainability and also landscape design strategies that addressed these kind of technologies aspects. For example, as we know, like it's a kind of 24-hour living city, there must be waste. And then those waste, through landscape design, through sustainability strategies, some of the waste can be recycled and feedbacks to the landscapes for like the vegetations to grow. And then we also plan some kind of landscape area or open space as a kind of urban farming. So basically, the thing that you consume within the districts, you could use that waste and then to recycle it back. Yeah, that was our approach.
We're looking at some low-tech kind of stormwater filtration kind of technologies of sorts, but I think the bigger idea is like what we've been saying, is to let the infrastructure itself be neutral and let people occupy and use it in the way that they can and bring their own ideas to the table. And
And I think the projects that I've worked on and done so far here have all been pretty analog. They're pretty hardware based rather than
About
anything.
putting people in a spot again.
Yeah, but the conversations which I've had with other, landlords, property owners, people that are interested in doing things to improve either through design or through arts integration, are much more interested now in how to use light installation, sound installation as well, as a sort of. On the one hand, I think because it's less financially draining, but also can be adaptable to changing program basically, and it's certainly coming up in the priority list.
Yeah, and you need things to be able to do that. You need like electricity, and then those sorts of things. Do we have any comments or questions from the audience?
实在不好意思，在最后的时间我还是想提一个
I'm
小
sorry.
小的问题。
I have to ask this question at the very last moment.
我所理解就是你们的这
What I
些工作
understand is
是不是可以称为公共艺术？
Your work has become a form of a public art,
就是在公共场合将艺术
meaning
与
in public spaces you use
公众
art
进行对话，然
to
后
dialogue with the
使
public.
更多的那个美
So that
或者是一些
more of the aesthetics
更有趣的生活方式
and interesting
带
ways
入
of life
带入普通的民
can
众
be
生活
brought
当中。
into the life of daily
但是
lives
就
of
是
layman people.
比如说博物馆中、艺术馆中的艺术作品
However,
和
for
观众
galleries,
之间，
for works in
总有一
galleries
道
and
隐形的
museums,
隔阂，拒绝
there
观
is
众
bound to be some
靠得
kind of
太
a
近或者触
barrier,
碰，就像刚
you know,
刚那
between
个
the
警示说
people
的，
and
禁
the
止
works. Just like
碰
on the
触艺
announcement
术
that we
品。
have been hearing, we are not supposed to touch those artworks.
总有一些小的地方，它的艺术教育不是那么的
In
发
the
达，或
smaller
者是
places,
民
art
众对于
education
美、
is not
对于
all
艺
that
术
well done.
接触的不
And
够充
people
分，不是任何
do
一个
not
人都有
have sufficient
都有机
contact
会
or
进入到博物馆、艺
accessibility
术馆中。
with
那么
with
你们的
the,
这样的工作，公共
with
艺术
the,
是不是
art.
是一个
So-
更好的方式，将艺术、将美带入到人们的普通
Is
大
that
众的生活
a
当中？
better? Is that a better way to bring art into the life of people? What I feel is, what was your understanding about this, or perhaps what comments do you have regarding my comments just now? Thank you.
That's what we are trying to do. Make art more approachable. It's just like kind of your day-to-day life. As you move around in the city, you will go past the back alley, and actually one time when I was in the back alley, and some of the young ladies go out for lunch, they would say, "Wow, this is pretty," and they start to take photo. I think art should be as approachable as that.
Well, you mentioned education, and it's probably a learning curve, right? I mean, and it's very hard, I think, for maybe if you're on the other side of it and you want things to change in a certain way, right? But it's like you're just investing in kind of it's the long game, I would say, right?
Yeah, I think also infrastructure itself is not only about only mobility and access. Sometimes it's basically you create an environment or you create a scene for as the audience said, maybe it's not a kind of developed city. Then basically this infrastructure, this scene is trying to kind of educate the local people to kind of let them interest about, okay, there are kind of arts which in the more developing cities, they were doing art like this. And then they would get interested, they would research, and then they would try to see more, and then slowly, then we could educate them.
Yeah, I think that issue of public art being outside of an enclosed gallery space is very interesting because people come across the works without explanation. There's very seldom a info sheet telling you what it is or who it's by. They've got to be quite readable. They've got to be engaging, interactive, hopefully, but just posing an open question. They're not so guiding, I guess, as a piece of public art. You want them to provoke dialogue in a way, and that's I think the most successful public art does that. So it's very different to the museum context, exactly.
Well, the institutional affiliation is different too. It's with a museum or a gallery, there's the one institution, whereas as we've discussed, with the public art, there's 12 to 30 different kind of bureaus or what have you, just so that something doesn't get removed. I think we probably have time for another one if there is one. We're good. I'm getting this. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you guys so much.